I need you to understand something before this begins. I had one rule. 13 years. One rule. Don't look too closely at anything that reminds you of him. Don't notice the way certain men sit in restaurants like they own the silence. Don't clock the angles. Don't read the glass. I was wiping down the bar when the light caught wrong on the window across the street, and my father's voice came back from the dead and said, "For seconds, Leah, move." I didn't think. I crossed the floor of that restaurant, leaned over a stranger's table, and pressed my mouth to lips so cold they felt like the first night of winter. And when I pulled back and looked into his eyes, God, whatever was living inside them had been alive for centuries. If you've ever done something you couldn't explain, something your body chose before your mind could stop it, stay. This one is for you. Trust me. I wasn't looking for anything that night. That's the truth I keep returning to because it matters. It matters that I wasn't looking, that I had gotten very, very good at not looking. 13 years behind a bar will do that to you. You learn to see just enough. You learn the geometry of a room, the weight of who sits where, who watches the door. My father called it situational awareness. I called it survival. After he died, I called it Tuesday. The restaurant was called Ardent. 23rd floor, downtown Sacramento. The kind of place where the wine list is longer than most people's lease agreements. I wasn't a guest. I was covering a private event for Nora, my coworker, who'd called in sick with a specific guilt in her voice that meant she wasn't sick at all. I'd taken the shift because I had nothing else. That's the honest version. I was restocking the service station near the window when the city lights shifted. One reflection. 1 degree of wrong angle on the glass of the building directly across the street. My hands stopped moving before my brain named what my eyes had seen. Crosshair. The shape of it was unmistakable, not because I'd seen it recently, but because my father had drawn it for me on a napkin when I was 9 years old and told me, "If you ever see this in glass, Leah, you don't have time to be scared." He tapped the napkin twice. "You only have time to move." I had 4 seconds. Maybe less. The shooter was patient, positioned, waiting for his window, and his window was the man sitting alone at the corner table. White suit, dark hair, a glass of red wine he hadn't touched. Sitting with the absolute stillness of someone who had never once in his life needed to pretend to be calm. The room was full. 12, 15 people. Candlelight. Low music. If I screamed, the shooter would take the shot anyway, and I'd have accomplished nothing except giving everyone in this room something to remember badly for the rest of their lives. My father's training didn't ask my permission. It simply moved my body. I set down the bottle. I crossed the floor. I was aware, distantly, of someone at a nearby table turning to look at me with a confused expression of a person watching something they can't categorize. I reached the corner table. The man in the white suit began to turn, his eyes finding me with a precision that suggested he'd known I was approaching before I took the third step. I didn't give him time to speak. I braced one hand on the cold marble tabletop, leaned across the distance between us, and kissed him. His lips were cold. Not the cold of someone who'd been outside, the cold of something older than temperature. Like pressing your mouth to the surface of a river in January and feeling the depth of it, the age of it, the darkness beneath. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The shot didn't come. I pulled back. He was looking at me. Not with confusion. That's what undid me. Every other person in the room who'd witnessed what I just did was wearing confusion like a coat. But this man, this impossibly still, impossibly pale man with a glass of untouched wine and eyes the color of deep water, was looking at me like I'd just said a word in a language he hadn't heard spoken aloud in a very long time. The 2 men at flanking tables were already rising. Security. I registered the shape of them, the training in how they moved, and something else. Something wrong in the way they were too fast, too coordinated, too. He raised one hand. One hand. A gesture so small it barely qualified as movement. They stopped. The room breathed again. And then his voice reached me, low, unhurried, with an accent that didn't belong to any single country or century, and he said, "You knew." Not a question. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. The crosshair reflection. I said. Third floor window. Building across the street. He's gone now. Professional shooters don't wait once the window closes. Something moved through his expression. Ancient and searching. Who trained you? I swallowed and said the name I hadn't spoken out loud in 13 years. My father. Garrett Murphy. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who didn't recognize the name. It was the silence of someone who recognized it completely and was deciding in real time, in front of me, what that recognition meant.
He stood.
Unhurried. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket with the particular ease of someone who has never once acted out of urgency. Come with me, he said. Not a threat, not a request. Something in between that I had absolutely no name for, and followed anyway. Because my father always said, the most dangerous moment isn't when something chases you. It's when something calls to you.
And you go.
The car didn't take me home. I knew it wouldn't. I watched Sacramento slide past the tinted windows, the grit of it, the familiar lights I'd memorized over 13 years of closing shifts and early mornings, and I understood, with a clarity that should have frightened me more than it did, that I was being carried somewhere I wouldn't easily come back from. He didn't speak during the drive. Neither did I. That was the first strange thing. The silence between us didn't feel like the silence between strangers. It felt like the silence between two people who had already said the difficult things and were simply resting in the aftermath. I watched his hands. Still. Folded once in his lap. Not the stillness of patience, the stillness of something that had simply stopped needing to fill space with movement. I had met men who cultivated stillness as a kind of power. This wasn't that. This was older than performance. This was what you became when you had outlived urgency itself. I didn't ask where we were going. My father would have called that tactical stupidity. My father was 13 years dead, and I was in a car with someone whose lips had been cold as river stone, so perhaps this wasn't the moment to invoke his judgment. The estate sat in the eastern hills above the city, and the first thing I felt when the gates opened was not awe, but recognition. The way you sometimes drive past a house and feel, without explanation, that the walls know something. Heavy stone.
Iron.
A garden that had been growing since before the neighborhood around it existed. The lights inside were low and amber and ancient feeling, the kind of light that doesn't so much illuminate as remember. Inside, everything was dark wood and wine-colored walls, and the specific silence of a place that had never been touched by ordinary life. No television noise. No refrigerator hum. No evidence of the small constant sounds that fill a lived-in space and remind you time is still moving. A woman named Imelda, silent, efficient, with the particular composure of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago, showed me to a room on the second floor. The room was too beautiful to feel like captivity. That was the deliberate cruelty of it, or the deliberate kindness, I still don't know which.
Dark velvet.
Heavy curtains that blocked the city entirely. A bed that looked like it had been made for someone important. I sat on the edge of it and pressed my palms flat against my knees and breathed. What did you do, Leah? Not a question. A reckoning. I had kissed a stranger, crossed a crowded restaurant, and pressed my mouth to a man I didn't know because my father's ghost had moved my feet. And now I was in a house that felt older than the city surrounding it, in a room that had been arranged for someone's comfort with too much care to be accidental. The practical part of my brain, the part my father built from the ground up, was already cataloging exits. 2 windows. 1 door. The garden below was accessible from the window ledge, if I took the drop at an angle. But I didn't leave. I think that's what I need you to understand. I had every tool to leave. I had 13 years of practice at leaving things that pulled too hard. And I sat on that bed in that too beautiful room, and I did not move. Because something in this house felt like the closest thing to stillness I had felt since he died. My father. Since I buried him and buried everything he'd made me and started serving drinks to strangers who would never know my real name. I had been so tired. For so long. And this house, this impossible, ancient, wrong house, was the first place in 13 years that didn't ask me to pretend. I found him on the terrace just after 2 a.m. I hadn't planned to. I'd given up on sleep and followed the cool air through a door I probably wasn't meant to open, and there he was, standing at the stone railing, looking out at Sacramento the way you look at something you outlived. Not with sadness, exactly. With the particular weight of someone who has watched things end so many times that endings no longer surprise them. Only the attachments do. Only the moments before. I stepped out beside him. He didn't turn. But he knew I was there. I understood now that he had probably known the moment I left the room. I looked at the city. The grid of lights below, the flat dark of the valley, the faint glow where the highway fed north toward the mountains. "How long have you been here?" I asked. Not in Sacramento. Not on the terrace. Just here. In the largest sense. A long pause. Then, long enough to watch this city build itself from nothing. Another pause. It forgot I was watching.
Cities do that.
People do too. Something broke open quietly in my chest. Because I knew that feeling. Not from centuries, from 13 years. From tending bar while the world moved around me, through me, past me. Forgetting I was watching. Forgetting I was there. We didn't speak much after that. We stood in the cold air of the Sacramento hills and watched the lights below, and I felt, without either of us naming it, something settle between us. Not safety. I was too old and too honest to call it safety, but something that rhymed with it. Something I had stopped believing I would feel again. His name was Dorian Vass. Sean told me the next morning, sitting across from me at a table long enough to seat 12, with coffee I hadn't asked for already waiting at my place. That was the thing about him, he anticipated without presuming. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. He had learned it somewhere in the long dark of all those centuries, and it undid me more than it should have. Dorian Vass. Covenant-trained. Patient. Precise. Part of an organization so well-funded and so carefully structured that it had survived longer than most governments, operating in the spaces between things, between laws, between cities, between the kind of violence people acknowledge and the kind they agree not to. "He's been contracted specifically for me," Sean said. "No drama in it. The way you describe weather." The order traces back to the Farron dynasty. San Francisco. Old grievance. Older money. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, and now he knows about me. Sean looked at me across the length of that table. "He knew about you within 48 hours of the restaurant." The number landed quietly. 48 hours. I had spent 2 days thinking I was processing what had happened, lying in that too beautiful room cataloging my exits, and the whole time a man trained to kill had already been building a file with my name on it. "So, I'm a target. You became one the moment you stepped between him and his shot." I nodded. I didn't feel panic, that surprised me, and then it didn't. My father had trained panic out of me by the time I was 14. What I felt instead was something colder and more clarifying. The particular focus that arrives when the options narrow down to only the ones that matter. "Tell me everything about the Farron line," I said. And he did. The days that followed had a shape I hadn't expected. Not imprisonment, I want to be precise about that because I know how it sounds. I stayed because the math was simple. Dorian Vass knew my face and my history, and the bar I'd worked in for 8 years was the first place he'd look. Nora was already being quietly watched over by 2 of Sean's people, a fact that made me feel guilty and grateful in equal, exhausting measure. But the staying, the actual texture of those days, was something I am still not sure I have words for. We talked. Not the way people talk when they're being careful with each other, that careful architecture of safe topics and managed revelations. We talked the way people talk when they've already run out of reasons to perform. When the situation has stripped the usual scaffolding away and all that's left is the truth of who you actually are. He told me about the Farron dynasty, their history, their reach, the particular brutality of old vampire politics that made human power struggles look almost innocent by comparison. I told him about the Covenant, the pieces of it my father had shown me, the maps and contacts and coded journals that I had burned in our backyard the week after the funeral because I had promised myself I was done. "I burned everything," I said one evening. We were in the library, his library, floor to ceiling, a room that smelled of old paper and time. Every record he kept. Every name. I thought if I destroyed the evidence of that world, it would stop being real. Sean was quiet for a moment. Did it work? I looked at my hands. I'm here, aren't I? It was on the fourth night that he told me about my father. We had been sitting in a silence that had become, by then, something comfortable, the kind of quiet two people build together without discussing it one evening at a time. And then he said, without preamble, in that voice that never wasted approach, I knew your father. The room didn't change. The light didn't shift. But something in my chest cracked so cleanly and completely that I had to set down what I was holding before I dropped it. I respected him, Sean continued. And the word respected, the weight he gave it, the age behind it, made my eyes burn immediately because that word from someone like him meant something different than it meant from anyone else. He wasn't paying a compliment. He was stating a fact that had outlasted the man himself. He was principled in a world that punishes principles, Sean said. He drew lines. He kept them. That is rarer than people know. I pressed my lips together, breathed through my nose, held myself together with everything I had because I was 36 years old and I had cried for my father in private for 13 years and I was not going to come apart in a stranger's library, even if the stranger had known him, had seen him, had kept him somewhere in centuries of memory. You tried to warn him, I said, because I had heard it in the pauses, in the particular shape of his grief, which was so old it had gone quiet. A long silence. I knew something was fractured inside the covenant, he said finally. I didn't know where. I sent word through a channel I believed was clean. He paused. It wasn't. There it was. The thing I hadn't known I was waiting 13 years to hear. Not an answer exactly, but a shape. A reason. The confirmation that my father's death hadn't been random, hadn't been simply the cost of the life he chose. It had been a betrayal. Specific and deliberate. And the man sitting across from me had tried to stop it. Had failed. And had carried that failure in silence for 13 years.
I didn't speak for a long time.
When I did, my voice came out smaller than I intended, scraped down to something true. He would have liked you, I said. That would have horrified him. But he would have liked you. Something moved across Sean's face. So brief. So human. I know, he said quietly. That's what I told him, the one time we met. And I stopped wanting to leave. Not because I had nowhere to go. Not because the threat outside made staying the logical choice. But because this man had known my father. Had tried to save him. Had failed and carried it the way I had carried it. In silence. Without anyone to give it to. And for the first time in 13 years, I was in a room with someone who understood exactly what we had both lost. That kind of grief, shared. It doesn't heal you. But God, it makes the weight easier to hold. I want to tell you that I went to see Nora because I missed her. That's part of it. The true part. 8 years behind the same bar builds something between two people, not quite friendship in the way the word gets used carelessly, but something more durable. The kind of knowing that comes from watching each other on bad nights, from covering shifts without being asked, from the particular shorthand of people who have stood side by side through enough ordinary hours that the ordinary becomes its own kind of love. But the other part, the part I'm less comfortable admitting, is that I needed to feel like myself again. The self I had built. The one with calluses and a closing routine, and a face that nobody looked at twice. 13 days inside that house. And I was starting to feel the edges of me go soft in ways I didn't trust. So I went, against the careful suggestions of the two people Sean had watching the building. Not against his explicit instruction, he hadn't forbidden it, because he understood by then that forbidden was a word that made me do things faster, but against the unspoken architecture of caution we had built together over those quiet evenings. I told myself I'd be an hour. I told myself I was being practical, visible, normal. I told myself a lot of things on the drive over. The bar looked the same.
Of course it did.
That's the thing about the places that hold your ordinary life. They don't register your absence the way you register theirs. The same bottles in the same order. The same crack in the third stool's leg that we'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Nora behind the counter with her dark hair pinned up and her expression doing that specific thing it did when she was pretending not to be worried. She hugged me before I sat down.
Hard.
The kind of hug that doesn't ask questions but contains them all. You look different, she said, pulling back to study my face. I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. She held my eyes for a moment. I said you look different. I let that sit and didn't answer, because Nora had always been smarter than the job required, and I wasn't prepared to explain the particular way a person looks when they've spent nearly 2 weeks in the presence of something ancient that sees them too clearly. We talked for 40 minutes. Normal things. Staff complaints. A regular who'd finally been cut off after one incident too many. The slow leak under the sink that maintenance kept promising to fix. I felt my shoulders drop somewhere in the first 10 minutes. Felt the familiar weight of the place settle over me like something I hadn't known I was missing until it was back. I was almost convinced I'd been wrong to worry. Almost. I felt him before I saw him. That's the training. My father called it the back of the neck, that specific, animal alertness that precedes conscious recognition. The room doesn't change. The noise doesn't change. But something in your body's deeper intelligence says, the geometry just shifted. I set my glass down without hurry. Scanned the mirror behind the bar. He was already inside. Dorian Vass was not what I'd imagined from the word hunter. No drama in him. Medium height, unremarkable coat, the kind of face that slides out of memory the moment you stop looking at it. He moved between the tables with the patient ease of someone who had already decided how this ended. His eyes found mine in the mirror, and something in his expression confirmed what I already knew. He hadn't come to threaten me. He'd come to finish it. I said quietly, without turning, Nora. Back door.
Now.
She knew me well enough to not ask why. What happened next lasted less than 90 seconds. I know that because I counted, my father drilled that into me, the importance of counting during violence, of keeping the part of your mind that measures time separate from the part that moves your body. 90 seconds of your worst life, he used to say, or the rest of it. You choose which one you're willing to pay. Dorian was fast. Covenant-trained fast, the kind that comes from years of drilling against opponents who don't tire and don't stop. His first move was precise, and would have ended most encounters before they started. I wasn't most encounters. My body remembered things my mind had spent 13 years trying to file away. The specific pivot my father had corrected 100 times in our driveway. The counter that uses a larger opponent's momentum as its own engine. Muscle memory doesn't care about your grief. It doesn't care about your 13 years of deliberate forgetting. It simply rises when the moment requires it and does what it was built to do. I put Dorian Vass on the floor in 70 seconds. The last 20 I held. Because before consciousness left him entirely, he looked up at me from the ground with blood at his temple and something in his eyes that wasn't defeat. It was delivery. Like he'd been waiting to say the thing he said next. The Farron family knows your name. His voice was already thickening. Your history. Your father's files. A pause. One rattling breath. And what you're becoming to him. Then he was gone. Out cold. Silent on the floor of the bar I'd worked in for 8 years. I stood over him. Breathing. Knuckles split on my right hand where they'd connected with the edge of his jaw. I looked at the blood on my fingers and felt, with a terrible clarity, that the woman who had tended bar here for 8 years, quiet and invisible and deliberately small, she had just become someone else entirely. Again. I heard the door. I didn't need to turn to know it was Sean. I heard it in the quality of the silence that accompanied him, that specific absence of sound that followed him like a shadow. When I finally looked up, he was standing in the doorway, taking in the scene. Dorian unconscious. The overturned stool. The blood on my hand. Me, standing straight, shoulders back, face composed in a way that I recognized, distantly, as my father's face. The one he wore when the world required him to be something larger than his fear. Sean looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression changed. Not softened. Not hardened. Something deeper than either, a shift behind the eyes that I can only describe as recognition. The kind that arrives when you finally see someone completely and understand, all at once, that you have been waiting for exactly this person without ever knowing you were waiting at all. He crossed the room, took my injured hand in both of his, looked at the split knuckles with an attention so careful and so quiet that my throat tightened immediately. He didn't say, "Are you all right?" He already knew I was. What he said was, "Your father would have been proud." And those 6 words, broke me open in ways the fight hadn't. In ways nothing had in a very long time. I didn't cry. I was my father's daughter, and I didn't cry in front of anyone who hadn't earned it. But I let Sean hold my injured hand in the middle of that bar. And I didn't pull away. And that, for me, was the same thing. There's a specific kind of grief that hardens over time. Not heals. Hardens. Like scar tissue over a wound that was never properly cleaned, functional, load-bearing, but carrying something inside it that was never meant to stay. I had been living on top of that hardness for 13 years. Moving around it. Building a life on the surface of it. Never pressing down too hard because I already knew, somewhere beneath the bartender hours and the quiet Sacramento mornings, that if I ever found out exactly how my father died, not the broad strokes, not the territorial violence that the people who knew me had whispered as explanation, but the actual truth of it, the specific human machinery of his death, I wasn't sure who I would become on the other side of knowing. I found out 3 days after Dorian Vass hit the floor of my bar. Sean moved on the Farron assets at 2 in the morning. Not because 2 in the morning is dramatic, because 2 in the morning is when human security rotations change and attention is lowest, and the particular biology of Sean's people made darkness a resource rather than a handicap. I had asked to come. I want to be precise about how I asked. Not with argument, not with the performance of capability I might have attempted with someone who needed convincing. I simply said I'm coming and watched his face and waited. He looked at me for a long moment. You understand what this is. I've understood what this is since I was 9 years old, I said. He nodded once. And that was the whole conversation. That's what I mean when I say he saw me. Not the bartender. Not the grieving daughter. Not the woman who had been hiding so long she'd almost forgotten what she was hiding from. He looked at the whole of me, the trained and the wounded and the willing, and he said yes to all of it. I don't know what to do with how much that mattered. The strike itself was fast and purposeful in the way that Sean's violence always was. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive, nothing that didn't serve a precise end. The Farron Sacramento holdings were 3 locations: a warehouse near the port, a private residence in the hills, a financial office operating behind a legitimate import business on L Street. I moved through the warehouse operation beside Rail, one of Sean's lieutenants, a man of very few words and absolute confidence, who had accepted my presence with the professional neutrality of someone who trusted Sean's judgment completely and extended that trust by extension to me. My father's training was not theoretical that night. It was present and physical and exact. Every choice I made in those rooms was a choice he had prepared me for, in a driveway in a Sacramento suburb, 2 decades ago, because he loved me enough to give me what I needed even though he knew it would hurt to watch me need it. By the time the sun began to suggest itself on the eastern edge of the valley, the Farron Sacramento infrastructure was gone. And we were back at the estate. And Sean sat across from me in the library and told me the truth about my father. He didn't soften it. I wouldn't have wanted him to. The man who betrayed my father was named Colton Briggs. Covenant-trained hunter. 15-year veteran. Respected inside the organization in the way that men who are very good at a specific violence tend to be respected, without question, with a kind of reflexive deference. He had been turned 4 years before my father's death. Quietly. Completely. Operating as a Farron informant inside the Covenant's highest levels, feeding intelligence, redirecting operations, identifying which hunters were getting too close to the Farron line's interests. My father had been getting close. Not to the Farron line specifically. He hadn't yet traced the shape of what Colton Briggs was. But he was following a thread that would have led him there eventually. My father was methodical in a way that made him dangerous. He didn't move fast, but he never stopped moving. And Colton Briggs had understood, as informants do, that a slow, persistent man is more threatening than a fast one. So he sold him. Gave the Farron line the date, the location, the route my father would be taking. Called it a territorial conflict. Dressed it in the ordinary language of that world's violence so that it would be processed and filed and mourned and forgotten. Sean told me all of this in a level voice, watching my face. And then he told me the rest, that he had known, in the weeks before my father died, that something was wrong inside the covenant, that there was a source he couldn't identify, a leak he couldn't locate, that he had sent a warning through a channel he believed was clean. The channel had gone through Colton Briggs. The warning never arrived.
I sat with that for a long time.
The library was quiet around us. Outside, Sacramento was waking up into an ordinary morning that had no idea what had happened in the dark hours before it. I could hear, faintly, the sound of the city beginning its day, the distant arterial noise of it, all those ordinary lives running their ordinary tracks. My father had been sold by someone he trusted, someone who wore the same identity he wore, who spoke the same language, who stood on what my father had believed was the same side of the line. The grief I had been carrying for 13 years, that dense, hardened, load-bearing grief, did not break. It reconfigured. That's the only word that fits. Like watching a structure you've been living inside suddenly reveal its actual architecture. The weight didn't change,
But the shape of it did.
and with the shape came something I hadn't had before. Understanding. My father didn't die because the world he chose was indifferent. He died because a specific man made a specific choice to betray him. And the man sitting across from me in this library had spent 13 years carrying the failure of not stopping it in time. We had both been grieving the same person, in the same silence, in the same city. I reached across the table and put my hand over Sean's. Cold, as it always was. Still as only he could be. "You couldn't have known," I said. He looked at my hand on his for a moment, then at my face. I should have been faster. "So should I said. I should have stayed in his world instead of running from it. Maybe I would have found what you were looking for." A long pause. "Or maybe," Sean said quietly, "you stayed alive because you left. And alive is what brought you to that restaurant." I thought about that, about the mathematics of survival, about how the things we survive to do are never the things we planned. I had kissed a stranger to save a life I didn't know the value of. And every choice that led me to that moment, every loss, every year of hiding, every night I tended bar while my father's training waited silently in my body like a held breath, had been the price of that one pivotal act. I didn't know yet what that meant for what came next. But I knew, sitting in that library with my hand over his and the Sacramento morning coming through the heavy curtains, that I had finally stopped running. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because I had finally found something worth standing still for. The Farron line didn't end dramatically. I think I expected it to, some final confrontation, some moment with enough weight to match everything it had cost. But that's not how these things end, usually. The people who've been studying violence for long enough know that the most effective endings are quiet ones. Sean moved through what remained of the Farron dynasty the way water moves through a structure with a crack in it, patiently, completely, without announcement. Within 6 weeks of that morning in the library, it was done. Dorian Vass disappeared from every location his network had on file. I don't know where he went. I didn't ask. There are questions that are really requests in disguise, requests to be made responsible for an answer, and I had learned from my father and from the months that had reshaped me to only ask what I was prepared to carry. What I knew was this: the threat that had pulled me out of my life had receded. The crosshair that had been pointed at everything I was still becoming had been removed, and I was still here. The question was what here meant now. I went back to the bar on a Tuesday. Not because I had decided something. Not because I had processed everything neatly into resolution the way people in less complicated lives sometimes manage to do. I went back because it was mine. Because 8 years of showing up somewhere and doing the work and learning the specific geography of a place makes it yours in a way that fear doesn't get to simply erase. I had let this world take my father. I had let grief take 13 years. I was not going to let danger take the last ordinary thing I had built with my own hands. Nora was behind the bar when I walked in. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, that particular Nora assessment, quick and complete, and then she handed me an apron without a word and moved to the other end of the counter. That was the whole reunion. It was exactly enough. I fell back into the rhythm of it within the hour. The muscle memory of service, not so different, I thought, from the other kind of muscle memory I'd been using lately. Your hands learn what they're asked to do. They don't forget. You just have to decide which memories you're willing to keep. He came in on a Thursday. No security. No rail waiting outside. No black SUV idling at the curb. Just Sean in a dark coat, taking the stool at the far end of the bar the way someone sits when they're trying to take up as little space as possible. Which, for a man who commanded the attention of every room he entered simply by existing in it, was quietly devastating in ways I wasn't ready for. I finished what I was doing.
Took my time.
Walked over. You don't drink, I said.
No.
So, I can't help you. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost. I think you can. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached under the bar and poured 2 fingers of the good whiskey, the bottle I kept for people who deserved it, and set it in front of him. He looked at it without touching it. The gesture wasn't about the drink, and we both knew it. Why are you here, Sean? No inflection on it. Not quite a question. The way you say something when you already know the answer, but need to hear it said aloud, outside your own head, where it becomes real. He looked up from the glass. And what was in his eyes in that moment? That ancient, undefended, utterly unperformed thing, made my breath go somewhere it couldn't be retrieved from. Every place else feels empty now, he said. Simple. Unadorned. The kind of sentence that a man only says when he has exhausted every alternative to honesty. I didn't respond. I didn't tell him to leave. I went back to work. And he sat at the end of my bar for the rest of the shift, not talking, not demanding, not filling the space with anything other than his presence, and something in the room felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, exactly the right size. We didn't have a ceremony. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters, not as an explanation but as a description of who we were. 2 people shaped by loss and long survival don't tend toward the theatrical. What we had didn't need an audience. It didn't need architecture or ritual or witnesses who would need the significance explained to them. What it needed was exactly what we gave it. A night, a room, 2 people looking at each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing and choosing it anyway. No vows written in advance. Just the truth spoken plainly, the way important things deserve to be spoken. I choose this. I choose you. Whatever that costs. Whatever it changes. Whatever it asks of me that I don't yet know how to give. He said it first. I said it back. And that was our marriage. We went somewhere old for the honeymoon. I had asked for that. Old light, quiet water, the kind of place where centuries have worn the edges off everything and what remains is simply what was always true. We found it on the Adriatic coast. A village that tourism had not yet fully discovered, where the stone was pale gold in the morning and the water was so still in the early hours that you could see the sky in it perfectly, unbroken. We stayed 3 weeks. I slept without listening for threats. I ate without thinking about the day's logistics. I sat beside the water in the mornings and let silence be silence instead of a thing to be monitored. I became, in those 3 weeks, someone slightly new. Or perhaps more accurately, someone slightly old. The version of myself that existed before grief taught me to make myself small. The morning I found out, I was alone in the bathroom of our rented house with the Adriatic visible through the small window, blue and permanent, and indifferent in the way that water is indifferent, present for all of it, moved by none of it. I sat on the edge of the tub for a long time, processing the impossible. The biology of his world said this couldn't happen. Every piece of knowledge my father had passed down, every account I had ever read in his careful files before I burned them, all of it agreed, consistently, that this was not a thing that occurred. And yet, I thought about the kiss. That first one, the one that started everything. Cold lips and a choice made in 4 seconds, and a life that had rerouted entirely in the aftermath. I had thought that kiss saved one life. I was only now understanding the full count. I found Sean on the terrace, looking at the water the way he'd looked at the Sacramento skyline that first night, like something he had outlived, but tenderly. I stood beside him, let the quiet sit for a moment. Then I took his hand and placed it flat against my abdomen, the way you place something precious somewhere it will be safe. He went very still, stiller than usual, which I had not believed was possible. When he turned to look at me, what was in his face was something I had never seen there before. Not the ancient knowing. Not the careful control. Something younger and rawer and more terrified and more luminous than anything centuries of survival had left room for. Leah. My name in his voice.
Just that.
I know, I said. I know it shouldn't be possible. His hand pressed gently where I had placed it. His eyes didn't leave mine. And yet, he said. And yet, I agreed. He pulled me into him then, not the protective hold of someone keeping you safe, but the hold of someone who has just been given something so large they need the physical reality of you to believe it. I felt his face against my hair. Felt the particular stillness of him, shaken for the first time. And I thought, this is what the kiss was for. Not the saving. Not the falling. Not even the choosing, though all of it mattered. All of it was true. This impossible, rewritten, unplanned thing that my body was already in the process of building. This was what it was all for. I used to think women like me didn't get this, the soft landing, the thing that stays, but I've learned slowly and at great cost that we do. We just find it in stranger places than most. If this story settled somewhere inside you, if it named something you've been carrying quietly, you're not alone in that. There are other women here who felt it too, women I've started to recognize in the city, in the early hours, in the parts of Sacramento that don't quite belong to daylight, carrying something in their eyes that the ordinary world never put there. We don't gather. We don't compare notes. But there is a knowing between us. A shared weight. This city has always sat at the edge of something older than its name, and some of us were never meant to escape that. We were meant to finally stop pretending we wanted to. If you don't want to lose this feeling, subscribe, and you'll always know where to come back to when you need it again.